We've got about an hour and a half or hour 45 here to go in a little bit of a different direction. I guess where we want to pick up, and again, if you have those texts in front of you, we probably will look at some of that here in this hour. But where we left off and pick up is this sense, therefore, of preaching as this direct discourse, right, that comes from the Father, has its origin in the Father, and this direct discourse that then comes through the Son. And here's where we want to pick up a little bit in terms of rhetoric. What we're going to talk a little bit about here in this first hour, that the Son is where this word has its form, right? And then this preaching, this discourse subsists in the Spirit, right? And you might say, therefore, that both the pastor and congregation, your preaching and the act of preaching takes place within this Trinitarian fellowship, right? The pastor, too, comes into this and is given his place within this communication. Right? The congregation is those who are in the Spirit and hear the Word. The pastor, therefore, has his very identity constituted within God's preaching. Okay? He gives voice to it. He has to contemplate, how do I body forth God's preaching? Right? And that means that the notion of form, and I think fundamental to the preaching act, as you wrestle with it, you not only study the Scriptures in preparation for preaching, but you have to contemplate words, giving this a form for your own people, right? So rhetoric, and the notion of rhetoric is of primary significance, certainly was in the ancient church too. Not only do I have to receive this, and certainly this preaching was seen as an act of traditioning, right? I mean, this is kind of what the early Christians kind of mean by this notion of tradition, and not tradition, which is kind of, in the Reformation, tradition becomes to kind of be a noun that refers to kind of resources in addition to Scripture or something. But tradition in the early church is a verb, that the gospel is a person-to-person encounter. Tradition is the verb that the Father does. The Father hands over His Son. Okay. That's certainly how early Christians took the words of institution, the Lord's Supper. I know we translate it on the night in which He was betrayed, but translated that way, betrayed almost always causes you to think about whom? Yeah, Judas. Yeah, early Christians, that word is paradidomi, right? On the night in which He was handed over. And they will take that as, yes, Judas is the one through whom this handing over happens and gives a certain form to that in the Passion. But the one who hands Jesus over is the Father, right? The Father hands over His Son for the life of the world. So the very life of the church is itself an act of traditioning, in which what we receive, we now hand over. And that is a deeply personal act, okay? You can kind of hear that in St. Paul, right? When he talks about imitating me, right? Imitate me as I imitate the Lord. He has His own personhood is in this, right? Is constituted in this act. And certainly preaching was part of that, right? That this is kind of how the church's life is constructed. Now, what we want to talk about, I guess, here in the next hour or so is to think about then the place of rhetoric, right? Not only is preaching a theological act, which is what we did maybe the last hour, but also a rhetorical act, the search for form. And I know as soon as I use the word rhetoric, you have certain ideas that are associated with that. You think maybe we tend to think of rhetoric as just style, and we think of it as just kind of functional. We think of what's effective. And that's, I think, again, is part of the problem of thinking about indirect discourse versus direct discourse. So there is a different rhetoric. If we think about this in terms of indirect discourse that we began with versus direct, that is, in indirect discourse, images, rhetoric functions in a certain way. Rhetoric is always going to be external to the object you're trying to inform about, right? So if we have this object, like the scientist studies something, and we have this kind of object or something, rhetoric is simply something that the use of images, the use of a certain kind of form of words, rhetoric, kind of exists on the outside, right? As you try to make this object understandable. Thus, the purpose of rhetoric becomes, how do I accomplish clarity? And rhetoric in form tends to be simply about illustration. I'm illustrating this thing, or I'm defining it functionally, right? I'm trying to sell it. We maybe think of a salesman. One of the things I've done in Teologia before is have people just think about the difference between preaching, or I'll ask them the questions, and have them reflect a bit. What's the difference between preaching and a salesman? The salesman speaks, or a politician speaks, or a reporter speaks. All these different kinds of speaking that we have in our culture. But how is preaching different than those things, right? All of those things are going to take place in this kind of indirect way, where I'm using rhetoric now to kind of manipulate the hearer. I'm either trying to interact with their intellect, I'm trying to get them to understand, in which case the purpose of rhetoric is clarity and has an intellectual purpose. Or I'm trying to manipulate them emotionally, maybe to buy what I'm after, right? You've all had that experience of getting something sold to you. So rhetoric can be used to deceive, to mislead, right? We're used to those kinds of things. And that's typically how kind of the scientist uses images. The images, the form, is not inherent in the object itself. I come up with, the speaker originates an image in order to make this effective for the hearer, or make it applicable to him, make it understandable, something like that. But what I want you to consider is that with indirect discourse, rhetoric is different. If we're talking about this person-to-person interaction, that a father speaking to a son, or a lover speaking to his beloved, right? And that kind of direct discourse where our very identities are constituted in that act of discourse, right? Now images operate differently. Images now become rhetoric, form, now become the very texture of our relationship to each other. They constitute it. They create an immediacy. They're the way I'm trying to express not just knowledge. I'm not just trying to express knowledge with it or trying to manipulate them. I'm trying to express my heart so that the same relationship that I have with them, my very identity is now present in them. I can communicate what they mean to me as a person, okay? So, so the sciences tend to use and we might say here, an indirect discourse, and especially like the sciences, they tend to like more literal language. Right? I mean, how is, if a scientist is given a discourse on the sun, what kind of language is the scientist going to use if he wants to teach you objectively about the sun? He's going to tell you what kinds of things. how hot it is, the energy that it produces, how far away it is from the earth or something. All these materialistic, thus mathematics is the language of science, you might say, right? It's a very literal and communicates in an objective way this information, right? Reduces it down to materiality. How would an artist speak about the sun? Not going to worry so much about those numbers, but it's going to be about their own experience of it, right? Maybe. How the sun, the warmth of that sun, the brightness of that sun, right? How it enlightens me, right? And allows me to see. It fills the landscape, right? It brings warmth. And it's going to, how do you express that experience? Can you just do that in literal scientific language exactly? Well, that's kind of hard to do. For instance, if you think about, how do you express your love, your personal encounter with your beloved? What kind of language are you going to have to use to express your love for this person, of what this person means to you? It's not going to do very well, for instance, if I, coming up here on, or Valentine's Day or something, or her birthday, I can't very well kind of say in a kind of literal deductive fashion, I can't say, well, proposition number one is that I like women. Okay. Proposition two, honey, you are a woman. Concluding statement, therefore, I like you. Right? That's kind of not going to do it, right? That might get something else involved, right? That's not how I'm going to express this person-to-person encounter. What kind of language am I going to have to use to express that? I'm going to have to use images. Images that bring three-dimensionality to it, right? They make it incarnate. They create an immediacy. They work on the level of the passions, right? Evoke a certain passion in them, as well as express a certain passion on my part, from my heart. And certainly early Christians took note of this. For them, when God creates the world, and certainly the way they thought of God was not that creation so much was an act of power, but they thought of it as an act of love. God is more like an artist who is expressing his own heart, right, when he creates. He's not just arbitrarily creating the cosmos as some kind of machine that just will work most effectively this way or something like that. He's expressing his own love for humanity, right? In fact, that's one of the radical things of the creation account in the ancient world, is that God actually makes the cosmos for man, not man for the cosmos. Okay? He doesn't just make man to serve an order or something, or to function within a machine of the cosmos the way maybe Greeks thought, right? And Greek philosophers thought. No, the whole world has been made precisely as an expression of his love for humanity. So how does Scripture speak? What are the images that are there? Jesus is going to say something like, I am the vine, you are the branches. Right? There's an image that creates immediacy, right? Communicates in a three-dimensional way, makes his own life-giving relationship to them concrete. This is what images do, and certainly as pastors come into this and see themselves as now given a place within this person-to-person direct discourse, they are going to be paying attention to rhetoric, right? How do I body this forth? How do I make God's love, his passion, his heart, how do I make that transparent to my people? This is the direct discourse that God simply engages in. Same with this is how they interpret the Old Testament. God uses images after image, right, to make incarnate his love for his people, whether that's or his disappointment in his people or his anger with his people, right? Sends snakes among them. That expresses a certain passion toward these people, right? A certain disappointment, or the temple, or the sacrifices. All of these things become finally expressions by which God is revealing his own heart to them. Okay? And I think when they thought of form, therefore, and I guess as we get to it, form is therefore for the early Christians a theological consideration. It's not just a practical consideration as it is maybe over here in Indirect Discourse, where it's just about what's the most effective way to do this. It is a deeply theological, aesthetic question. And that is to say that when God speaks, and certainly as they read Scripture, as they contemplated Christ, they thought about this. When God speaks, he does not merely speak an idea, he gives his word a form. His word has a form. God is a rhetorician from the beginning. Okay? And that the perfect form of that, of course, is the very flesh of Jesus and the narrative of his body. Okay? The Gospels are the perfect three-dimensional form of God's own heart and life, okay, and of his word. So God doesn't just present an idea, some kind of abstract idea that he loves you or something, and then leave it up to you to give it whatever form you want, okay? Or, as if you're going to be the originator of the form of it. No, that word already has a form. That form is there, constituted. This is what the second article of the Creed is. What is the form of his body? The Apostles' Creed, it's one of the things that's kind of obvious about the issues of the Apostles' Creed is that they are having an issue with those denying God as creator. So they expanded the baptismal formula from I believe in God the Father to what? I believe in God the Father Almighty, the maker of heaven and earth, right? The second article too is expanded. Not only are we baptized into the name of the Son, but how did they expand the second article? Every verb in the second article is about Jesus' flesh and the form of his body. So he's what? And in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived in a body, right? Born of the Virgin Mary, right? Suffered under Pontius Pilate, crucified, died, rose, ascended, will come again to judge, right? All of those are verbs that describe the form of his bodily life, right? And certainly, in fact, it's to me, the Apostles' Creed clearly is part of the battle with the Gnostics, right? I mean, it's the emphasis on Jesus' flesh, the narrative of his flesh. What you don't get in the second article, do you get anything about what Jesus taught? It doesn't say a word about what he taught. The Gnostics loved the idea of Jesus as teacher, right? And they wanted to speak about him teaching these kind of eternal truths. But the second article is all about what Jesus did in a body, right? And that's a very Eucharistic thing, right? Because as early Christians see it, I mentioned this last night, that the medium, if we think of God as an artist, the medium in which he loves to express himself, the primary medium in which he loves to express himself is human flesh and blood. Okay. From the beginning, man is formed by the hands of God as his own image and likeness. Right? God loves to work with humanity. It's in humanity that he is expressing his own life. And wants humanity to be that. He's made man, therefore, for himself. And of course, that for early Christians opened up to the incarnation, the primary form of God's life, the perfect revelation of his heart is the flesh and blood of Jesus, right? And so the Eucharist and preaching just were inherently together in the biblical narrative, right? I mean, the Eucharist is the very reality of what the Bible speaks about, right? But the Bible is the narrative of that which is on the altar, right? That flesh that's on the altar has a narrative, and that is given to us in the Gospels and confessed in the Creed. Right? So that sense of how we contemplate form, that's why when they read the Scriptures, they're going to also think that there is a form given to the Bible. These biblical actions, this narrative about Jesus, they're going to pay close attention to the form of the words, right? And the form of the events. They like to contemplate on that kind of thing. And you might say, use that to preach, and here's where images become important again. They preach to the eyes of people. They don't just preach concepts or to the intellect. They are preaching to the eyes, right? They are seeking in these images and in their rhetoric to make the love of God flesh, right? Present immediately to them. So that sense of the way they're thinking of rhetoric, that form is a theological reality, that God has a form, and the pastor therefore doesn't invent, or the preacher doesn't invent a form. He contemplates that form and then seeks to embody it or proclaim it to his people. Here's where, it also led, as I kind of alluded to, a certain reading of the Bible. And I might mention this as well. Certainly the way they read the Old Testament in this direct way is maybe a couple of things here just to mention. One, it meant that the narrative of the Bible was not just descriptive. The narrative of the Bible, the history of the Bible was prescriptive. It actually preached, and they believed it preached. The form mattered to the narrative. It wasn't just, that's just historically how it happened. God was expressing himself in these three-dimensional forms. So when you got something like Adam, when Eve is brought forth, what has to happen to Adam for Eve to be brought forth? He's put to sleep. Why does he have to be put to sleep? Why is that form important? Because they're already seeing what? For Eve to have life, man is put into a fundamental vocation of self-sacrifice to her. We're already seeing an image of the passion of Jesus as far as early Christians are concerned, right? That he is put to sleep and put into a relation. It is the fundamental vocation of husband, right? Is to lay down your life for your wife, right? I mean, that's Adam is already put into that relationship, and that relationship has a form that's given to it there. And the fact that it's out of his side that it's taken. There's so many of these things we can emphasize, whether that's, Moses, every plague he does is how. It uses, especially if you read the Septuagint, the Bible of the early Christians, the Greek, you're going to get all this use, for instance, of the word ektenos. Ektenos means to extend your arm, right? God delivered with an outstretched arm. Moses, extend your arm, right? Your hands. The first place you actually have ektenos is when God comments on Adam and Eve in the fall. They say, lest man also extend his hand and take of the tree of life and live forever, right? And so he's exiled. Well, that's a very cruciform image for early Christians. They're going to see inherently there the kind of cruciform image that in the very form of the way that text happened. A couple places where you get that, the history is prescriptive. It actually preaches. It's not just descriptive. One actually is very, I probably get in trouble for recommending this, but it's definitely worth your while. It is the little radio lectures of John Paul II on the theology of the body, right? And he actually makes a wonderful point there based on Matthew 19, that when Jesus discusses with the Pharisees about divorce, Jesus references the beginning twice. And his emphasis there is that for Jesus, the beginning, and Jesus quotes both a verse from Genesis 1 as well as Genesis 2, that for Jesus, the beginning is prescriptive. It is authoritative for what marriage is. The form of that narrative, Genesis 1 and 2, is not just how things happened. It is prescriptive for what it means to be human, right? It is therefore fundamental, and Jesus quotes it as authoritative. He's quoting the history of Genesis 1 and 2 as authoritative over their quotation from wherever it is, Deuteronomy or Leviticus. The other place is how Jesus emphasizes the Sabbath, right? They get criticized for pulling stuff off the grain on the Sabbath and eating it, the disciples. And Jesus says what? He doesn't actually have a discussion about the third commandment or something, but he actually refers to what history? David actually, so the history of David is prescriptive. It preaches about the Sabbath and that man is the Lord of the Sabbath, right? Again, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, right? So that sense that in the text, in the very narrative, we have now a form. And that also comes out of the way they read the Bible, I think, too, which is, I might mention it here, but is this relationship, I know we talk a lot about typology and type, antitype, and that kind of thing. And my frustration with that just a little bit is that it ends up just being a literary technique about how texts relate to each other, and I don't think quite captures the early Christian reading. They typically think always in terms of archetype, type, and or image. You know what an archetype is? In the ancient world, archetypes are the permanent pattern. So,
Like Plato's forms?
Okay, yeah, certainly it comes out, it gets an expression in those terms. But, you have it in a very practical way for something like, the emperor or the king. He would have a seal, right? He would have a ring that had a pattern in it. It was permanent and eternal, that pattern, that form. And then when you press that form into malleable material, like wax, it leaves behind what? It generates a copy, right? Generates an image of itself. And of course, that image was crucial significance. It sealed the document, and that document had to be delivered, and your job that was one of the jobs of a deacon, right? Was to deliver these commands from the emperor or something, or from the king. If that seal was not intact when the general gets it, the general can't be sure of what? I mean, if that seal's not kept intact, it could be corrupted, right? So he kind of can't, well, do I follow this order or not? I mean, he now all of a sudden he has a question about it. So that seal was very important, right? We have that same kind of thing, I guess. I still, when I began at the seminary, I didn't get a computer until I went on vicarage or whatever. I still had those old electric typewriter, right? And that's an archetype, right? You have the permanent metal, it presses into the ink and it leaves behind an image, right? Well, Christians too approach this the same way, that the archetype precedes the type or the image, right? And for early Christians, and this is where it disagrees with, how they disagree with the Greeks and like Plato's forms had no flesh to them, right? They were unknowable, right? And which made that a problem. But for Christians, the archetype is the body of Jesus. This is what the Word became flesh and dwelt among us means, that the archetype is in the flesh. The flesh has been taken into the archetype. So if you read, this is how a lot of them understood John's gospel. Irenaeus certainly does. So, for instance, in John 2, if you think of all these images in John's gospel, John 2, the temple is an image of what? The body of Christ. But the archetype's not invisible. The archetype is visible, right? That's the whole point. The flesh of Christ is the archetype that produced the image of the temple, right? Thus the temple can only be understood as an image of the body of Jesus. You get that in so many of these other ways, whether it's the raising up of the serpent in the wilderness in John 3, right, as the way in which the new birth happens. The manna in John 6, right? The true bread from heaven is Jesus' flesh. You could go on with so many of these images. Jacob's ladder in John 1, the wedding in John 2. All of those, you might say, the Old Testament are generated and have their meaning precisely there in the body of Jesus himself. So that is the form, and as they think of rhetoric, that's what they're trying to give expression to, right? In their preaching and trying to kind of engage. But yeah.
Well, in the building of the temple, it even talks about that it's the pattern. It's according to a pattern that's being given from above.
Right.
And so you're saying that pattern actually is not some sort of formless, but this is the body of Christ.
Yeah, that's a typical early Christian perspective of the Old Testament. For instance, they will always maintain that when he sees the ladder, he's seeing the crucified Christ. Jacob of Sarug will simply begin his sermon on Jacob's ladder with, the Lord stood on the cross as on a ladder with many rungs. Okay. So what they're always going to maintain is that Jacob's vision is actually the crucified Christ. He's the archetype, right? And there is a difference in translation, right? You can, in fact, translate it that not that the Lord was above the ladder, but that the Lord was on the ladder. The preposition is epi, right? Certainly the way they took it. Maybe John 1 is actually kind of brings that out, right? Nathaniel, you'll see angels ascending and descending upon the Son of Man, right? The Son of Man is the way. He is the ladder. His cross is the archetype. Just as he is for Moses lifting up the serpent. And thus he says, I am the way, right? And he means his cross. The other place that comes, even when he says, I'm the door in John 10, he's talking about his cross. Because he talks about the thief is the one who tries to ascend by a different way, right? He doesn't ascend by means of the cross. And they a lot of times thought of the cross as a ladder, right? Why do you picture the cross this way where you exaggerate the head plate, right? And you exaggerate the footstool? What are you trying to make it look like? Looks like a ladder, right? That which unites heaven and earth, right? Which you get that kind of thing, that kind of interpretation very early. So that sense, they're paying very close attention, therefore, in images, interpreting the form of images. I always think some of our difficulties, we always think images are images of an abstract idea. And so our movement exegetically is, okay, the image, but what's the image illustrate? We used to be taught a parable had one truth behind it or something. That's a very, now you talk about Platonic, that's a very Platonic way. We have this visible form and then we try to get to some kind of abstract, this just illustrates whatever, this concept. No, they're going to interpret images, the form itself, and meditate on those things, okay? That's how, in this direct discourse, that's how a lover and a beloved are going to interpret these things. They're interpreting, why did they use that word and not that word? Why didn't they say anything about this? They are deeply tied up into the, why use that image, right? What's he saying with that image? There's always that kind of struggle to commune with the other, right? Which is what language is trying to do. Rhetoric is about accomplishing a communion with the other. And they do think of it in a very personal way. There's a personal exchange that takes place through rhetoric. And the only way to do that is through images. Thus, the language of the Psalms, the language of the Old Testament, the parables. Maybe to see this, and this is what I wanted to get to, with regard to rhetoric, if you got your text, I wanted you to look at, maybe turn I guess on your thing it would be the second page, the Rhetoric of Augustine. I gave you some texts from Augustine. He probably explains this or expresses it better than I do. But I wanted you to just notice some things from it. And I know that that's small lettering. I hope I can actually read it. But no, that's fine. You saved paper anyway.
I meant to do on both sides.
Right. So you see the Rhetoric of Augustine. I've given you a couple of sources. One is his De Doctrina Christiana, which is 4 books, and the 4th book is the most prominent, in the history of the church. His 4th book is on rhetoric, was the homiletics textbook of the church for, still is, I think, in some places. In fact, we brought this back in Theologia Preaching, where they have to engage Augustine's 4th book on his De Doctrina. But I just want you to notice how he thinks about language. And I've given you that first text there on the first page is from the preface to the whole work. Just notice how he thinks about language, and language as tradition, as this direct person-to-person kind of encounter. This is how he thinks of language. And he's dealing with, we're not going to read it all, obviously, but we'll begin there with that paragraph 5. And he's definitely dealing with people, kind of charismatics, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it. Those who think that they don't need to learn from another human being, but can learn directly from the Spirit, right? And they should wait for enlightenment from the Spirit rather than waste their time in the community learning from another human being. So just notice how he speaks. We'll just read there a little bit. Section 5, but if anyone thinks that these stories are false, I do not strongly insist on them. But as I am dealing with Christians who profess to understand the Scriptures without any directions from man, these are the people he's critiquing. These people that claim to understand without any direction from man. And if, in fact, this be so, they boast of a real advantage, and one of no ordinary kind. Yet they must surely grant that every one of us learnt his own language by how? How do you learn a language? Even if we're going to hear it from the Spirit, we only learn language from another person. It is a deeply person-to-person interaction. We only learn it hearing it constantly from childhood. And that any other language we have learned, Greek or Hebrew or any of the rest, we have learned either in the same way by hearing it spoken or from a human teacher. Now then, suppose we now advise all our brethren not to teach their children any of these things, because on the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, the apostles immediately began to speak the languages of every race, and warn everyone who has not had a like experience that he need not consider himself a Christian, or may at least doubt whether he has yet received the Holy Spirit. No. Rather, let us put away false pride and learn whatever can be learned from man. So notice here that man has an agency in this. Man is not just on the receiving end. Man is given an agency in God's direct discourse. And for Augustine, that's going to be fundamentally founded on the incarnation, right? That God now speaks in a human voice, right? Early Christians, I don't think they would understand that our kind of distinction between Augustine, of course, Augustine's maybe the fault of, but between the Word and the sacraments. And a lot of times, of course, based on Augustine, we talk about the sacraments have a visible thing, but the ancients wouldn't, I don't think, would quite understand that, because the Word has to have a human voice. A human sound is as material and as much a part of this created world and human world as any visible thing, as bread and water are, right? The Word is just as sacramental, therefore. It has a medium of the human voice, right, and human words. And that, they learned throughout the Scriptures, the human agency. I always think, you have to kind of be careful on the kind of, you can go too far with divine monergism and that God just does it and man has no agency in it, because it's kind of what Moses wanted at the burning bush, right? God says, go down to Egypt, and what's Moses' comment? Well, God, why don't you just do it? Just kind of leave me out, right? And no, he wants a man to do it, right? I love that story with Joshua when he comes to Jericho. It's closed up, and used to be read, I think it was a text, used to be read for St. Michael and All Angels Day. That angel shows up, the warrior of God, and Joshua's first thought is, are you going to fight for us? He's like, yeah, we got, I've just been, I don't have to worry about this anymore. And of course, what does the angel say? No. But here's what you're going to do, right? I mean, there is man is given an agency. No, he doesn't cause in that sense, but he is given an agency through which God accomplishes the salvation of the world. That's part of what anthropology is. Man is made for God, right? I always kind of am disappointed because History 1, I can get through Chalcedon, and I feel like I have to get that far because that's really where the Nicene Creed finally is accepted as an ecumenical creed. And a lot of times I just run out of time after that. But the council after that, the 5th and 6th councils of Constantinople, the church wrestled with this. And if you know kind of, I don't know how much you know of those Christological controversies, but monothelitism, the church is going to reject that. And precisely what they were saying is that the salvation of the world depends on the human will of Jesus. His human will has to be there, right? He has to, in Gethsemane, bear that fear, right? And express that fear of not this cup. And then, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done, right? That denial of himself. So the human agency, you can kind of, this is what we mean, that in this person-to-person encounter is a kind of anthropology. So language is inherently human, right? And is learned by tradition in this kind of person-to-person relation. But now skip from there. That was the main point there. I think we can maybe leave that. There's some others maybe just to draw your attention to in the time that we have. Go to the next page then, and we'll get to, maybe we don't have to read so much that, but the first one there is De Doctrina Christianae, Book 4, Chapter 7. And here, is just the simple truth that all rhetoric doesn't begin with really the speaker, but comes out of God, right? And comes out of the Scriptures. So maybe just read a little bit there. A number of other points, he says, bearing on the laws of eloquence could be found in this passage. which I have chosen as an example. He had just quoted a text from Paul, I think. But an intelligent reader will not be so instructed by carefully analyzing it as kindled by reciting it with spirit. That in and of itself is kind of interesting. Augustine was genuinely shocked when he came across Ambrose reading the Bible silently. For him, reading the Bible was always to be out loud as a discourse, right? It had to be a living voice, right? That's the way it was supposed to be heard. So the idea of just kind of reading the text internally, that's not how he operated. It had to be recited, had to be direct discourse in that regard. Nor was it composed by man's art and care. Notice the scriptures aren't simply from man, but it flowed forth in wisdom and eloquence from where? Notice the origin there of the form of the text came out of the divine mind, right? So God is the rhetorician, and we read the Bible in terms of his rhetoric, right? Noticing the wonderful images and the patterns that he has put there, right? And wants you to kind of contemplate. Maybe the next one there, I've given you a couple. Maybe we should read these. The next couple are from his De Catechizandis Rudibus, which means the catechizing of the uninstructed or the catechizing of the rude people. And the occasion of this letter, this is worth your reading. It's not a long letter, but it's a little letter Augustine wrote to a man named Deo Gratius, who was a catechist. And he had been a catechist for a long time, which meant he had been instructing people in the Christian faith. And he writes a letter to Augustine saying, look, I'm just bored with this. I'm tired of doing it. You know, this stuff is rudimentary. I have a hard time getting excited about it. I don't have any excitement or energy behind it. And so what do I do? You know, I'm tired of doing this. Well, Augustine writes this, De Catechizandis Rudibus, in answer to him. And just notice, again, you can hear a theology of rhetoric that's going to be very much connected to his theology of love, which, if you know Augustine, this is the central thing, I think, that you find in him. God is love, and that's how he thinks of the Trinity. But notice how he understands rhetoric there in De Catechizandis Rudibus, chapter 10. For however much our articulate speech may differ from the vivacity of our intelligence, much greater is the difference of the flesh of mortality from equality of God. And nevertheless, although he was in the same form, what did God do? God emptied himself, taking the form of a what? I mean, for Augustine, this is the ultimate rhetorical act on God's part. That God, in fact, this is what rhetoric does. The speaker empties himself for the sake of his hearer, right? That God emptied himself and took the form of a servant. He condescended. And so on down to the words, the death of the cross. What is the explanation of this? But that he made himself weak to the weak in order that he might gain the weak. Listen to his follower, it's Paul, as he expresses himself, also in another place in this effect. For whether we be beside ourselves, it is to God, or whether we be sober, it is for your cause. For the love of Christ, and here's where he kind of comes to the love of Christ, the love of Christ constrains us, because we thus judge that he died for all. Now notice how he applies it to rhetoric. And how indeed should one be ready to be spent for their souls if he should find it irksome to even bend himself to their ears? For this reason, therefore, he became a little child in the midst of us, and like a nurse cherishing her children. Now this is a nice image here. For is it a pleasure to lisp shortened and broken words, unless love invites us. And yet men desire to have infants to whom they have to do this kind of service. Do you get the image there a little bit of the rhetoric of God? How do you speak to an infant? Say dada, 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 right? And then when the kid, however vaguely, probably doesn't actually say it at all, but close enough, you get all excited, right? Now, what is it that makes it pleasurable to condescend to your child and say, say dada, say dada? It's not because you love the intellectual exercise of that. It's an expression of your what? Of your love for them, right? A love that will sacrifice itself, right? That bends down to them, that condescends to them. That's the rhetoric of God, right? He comes down to man and gets on their level, right? His rhetoric is about creating communion with them, binding himself to them, loving them. And again, it becomes, how do I express my love for them? The passionate character of rhetoric, right? So it's a kind of a nice image. And let's see. As he goes on there, Augustine did love little children. He was you could almost say, somewhat obsessed with infants. He preaches about them a lot. And you can see him go on a little bit to the hen. So he continues there. Is it a sweeter thing to a mother to put morsels of masticated food into her little son's mouth and to eat and devour larger pieces herself? In like manner, accordingly, let not the thought of the hen recede from your heart, who covers her tender brood under her drooping feathers, and with broken voice calls her chirping young ones to her. While they that turn away from her, fostering wings in their pride, become a prey to birds. For if intelligence brings delight in the purest recesses of the mind, it should also, he says, be a delight to us to have an intelligent understanding of the manner in which charity descends to the lower objects, finds its way back, right? So notice that all the Reformed like to talk about Augustine in terms of this intellectual character of Augustine, but you can hear him even more delighting than the intellectual aspect of theology is to condescend to charity, right? And to empty ourselves for our brother. He does the same thing. Look at the next one here, a little bit of how rhetoric creates community in this direct person-to-person kind of interaction. Once more, however often I feel wearisome to go over repeated matters, which are thoroughly familiar and adapted rather to children. If this is the case with us, Augustine says, then we should endeavor to meet them with a brother's, a father's, and a mother's love. And if we are once united with them, thus in heart, to us no less than to them will these things seem new. Notice that sense of a community of heart, right? That we are united to them. Now notice he continues, for so great is the power of a sympathetic disposition of mind. That's what rhetoric tries to accomplish. A sympatheia, where we share and resonate with each other's humanity, right? Not just intellectually, but resonate with them in the heart. For so great is the power of a sympathetic disposition of mind that as they are affected while we are speaking, we are affected while they are learning. And so, notice the next line, we have our dwelling where? We have our dwelling in one another. That's rhetoric seeks in this exchange, this conversation, to create communio, right? To create a communion that resonates passionately with one another, where they experience my love, my frustration, my anger, my disappointment, and I resonate with theirs, right? And we suffer in, with, and through each other as a body. So we have our dwelling in each other. And then he uses an image, maybe I won't read this, but you can read it on your own, but he uses a nice image of being a tour guide. Augustine was in North Africa. He probably took people to see kind of some extraordinary sights, maybe took them on safari or something. Now, what he says there is, okay, myself, I've been to see these sights 10, 15 times. After you've seen them enough, what? Not that excited about them. I did my vicarage in Palo Alto, California. Family all wanted to come and visit. Obviously not to visit me, but because they just wanted me to take them around, right? They wanted to see, I'd never seen San Francisco. I went to San Francisco, I don't know how many times. Alcatraz, Golden Gate Bridge, redwood trees, all that stuff, right? No, if you've been there several times for yourself, you're just kind of, And if I'm by myself, I'd never go and visit them anymore. I'd already seen them, right? And they were great, but when somebody visits, what happens? Because they've never seen it before, and as you take them around, they start to what? They start to get excited about what they're seeing. They're like, wow, or they start to kind of really enjoy the sights that you are showing, and then their enjoyment does what to you? If you love them, and if you have a kind of sympathetic mind, their enjoyment starts to what? Well, renew your own enjoyment, right? You have a kind of resonance passionately. Early Christians always thought of the mechanism of our communio is sympatheia, a theological sympatheia, that this is what it meant to be a person. You can sympathize with people. Being a person is that you can experience somehow what they are experiencing. I don't know if you've ever, I remember one time traveling, coming out of the airport, kind of tired and, been a long trip, but seeing at the same time, obviously, a couple being reunited after a long time, right? The man came out of the door and, his beloved did what? Came running up to him, embraced, and you could tell just in the kind of joy of it. Now, I didn't just observe that, but just seeing it, I started to feel what? I couldn't kind of help but smile. I could experience kind of the same joy, even though I did not have the experience they experienced, right? I didn't know it at all, but I could resonate with it passionately. That's the mystery of our personhood, that we can, in fact, enter into that communio, that kind of sympatheia with each other. And certainly for Augustine, this is an important thing to facilitate. This is what rhetoric is about. How do we facilitate the intimacy of that kind of exchange, where they're not just learning what we know and learning how to imitate in speaking what we know intellectually, but the very, shall we say, passionate relationship I have with God is now in them and begins to resonate with them. That's why, for Augustine, when you preach, you're always preaching finally yourself. Yes, you're preaching Christ, but you cannot help but preach your own relationship to Christ, your own love for Him, right? So I do think people are ultimately in preaching always looking to see, they'll always say they want a preacher who's authentic. I think that's part of this, right? Do you actually believe what you are saying, right? And can you kind of communicate that kind of passion? In fact, this is the way Augustine preached. I know the rest of them, I don't know, we have to do a lot with. He talks in the next one, De Gottesdienst, chapter 2. There, I think, you look at the first couple of lines of that. Indeed, with me too, it is almost always the fact that my speech displeases myself. He can never it is part of the artist and preacher's curse that you can never quite say it the way you would love to say it. You struggle to find Have you ever known an artist to be happy with what they've made? You know, my daughter's an artist. She paints, does different things, but there's always a certain just utter suffering to it, you know, because you can never. That's why writing is there's a suffering, right? I used to think of my dissertation was kind of like the closest I could get to giving birth. You know, I can't give birth, but it was kind of like that, right? It was a passionate experience because you could never. Even what you've come to understand, you have a hard time, then how do I find the words to actually say this? And actually body it forth so someone else can kind of understand what I'm talking about. And that's what he's saying here a little bit too. It's always a fact that my speech displeases myself. For I am covetous of something better, right? Because of your love for God, you're always trying to find something better, right, to say. Or in your love for the people. The possession of which I frequently enjoy within me before I commence to body it forth. Notice how he thinks of rhetoric. It's a bodying forth of kind of what he's come to enjoy, delight in within him. Thus, the next one also kind of talks about, you know, your preaching is an act of prayer. This is the way Augustine preached. He would spend his days preparing, simply praying the text. This is why he loves to preach on the Psalms. You know Augustine's kind of relationship to the Psalms. When he was on his deathbed, he knew he was going to die. That's what he did. He actually copied all the Psalms and put them up on the wall around his room. And, you know, he wasn't well enough really to leave, and all he would do is get out of bed and he would just go, just go from psalm to psalm, right? And just pray them, right? And that's how praying was a way of internalizing, you know, the ancient world to read the scriptures for the early Christians is to pray. There's no way to separate them. It's always a dialogue. If the Bible subsists in direct discourse, then at the same time you are hearing what God is saying, it evokes a response out of you, a passionate response. And so you pray. You always pray in and with and through the scriptures. It was a new way of meditation, right? The Greeks, we always talk, Plato liked meditation. But for him, meditation was narcissistic. It was all a turning into self. Christian meditation was on Scripture. It was praying to God in a dialogue that was in and through the Bible. It's why, you know, maybe I get in trouble for saying this too, I don't know, but it is why for the ancient world it was no big deal to think that their prayers were passing in with and through the saints of the Bible. Because as they're reading the Bible, how has the Word of God come to them? It's come in and through John, Peter, Paul, Matthew, Mark. There is no Word of God except as it has come through the apostles, through the saints, right? Through Abraham, through Isaac, through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So it was natural for them to think that their prayers were always in with and through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was always in their company. Now, of course, there's an abuse that can happen there if you start to pray to this saint independent of Jesus or something, or outside of Jesus, or as if they have something independent of Jesus. But a prayer is always to God. But it was always for them in the company of the Scriptures, right? And the saints that were there, whose voices were there, right? So that sense of he would pray the psalm and internalize this dialogue. That's not a scientific exegetical act. It was a very subjective person-to-person encounter with God in and through the text. And he would therefore make notes in the sides of the text, in the Psalms. And then when he got up in the pulpit, all that dialogue with God would just come out. And he would just make that accessible to the people. I mean, it basically is kind of how he preached is to invite them into his own dialogue with God in and through and with that text, right? So that sense, I remember having a conversation with a colleague at one Winkle, maybe at the beginning. It's the first time I kind of thought about some of this stuff, how personal your preaching is. This colleague always maintained that he could write his sermon, and it didn't matter if he gave it. He could give it to an elder who could get up in the pulpit and read it, and it was the same as if he himself preached it. I'm very resistant to that. That's to say that preaching is just words and just a function, and your personhood is not in it. I would imagine that the same words could come from you to your people and come from me to your people, and they would understand them completely differently, probably, just based upon their personal relationship with you and how those words would be taken. If I got in there and they were suspicious of me, they would probably hear my words a certain way, right? Or if they hated your guts, they might accept it from me, right? There's that kind of thing. It is always a personal, deeply personal interaction, I think. At least is how Augustine kind of hears that, okay? Well, maybe that's enough from... Oh, did I give you... Maybe you didn't copy this. I wonder if there was a sermon from Augustine. I thought maybe I sent you... Pastor Eckert, is it in here somewhere? Okay, yeah, after the Chrysostom sermon. Yeah, that's really little, isn't it?
The only thing I did not copy was that 40-page thing. I copied just the first 2 pages.
Yeah, we won't worry about Melito. I guess that's too long. But there is, you get down to Sermon 229 by Augustine. It looks like that, if you're trying to find it. It's after the Chrysostom sermon is the double-spaced text. We may look at that later if we have time. But this Sermon 229 is just the one little sermon I gave you from Augustine just to illustrate it. These are his liturgical seasons, sermons and liturgical seasons. This is one of his sermons. We'll just read maybe the first couple of paragraphs. I just want you to see how he preaches a bit in terms of engaging people's identity. He's preaching to their identity. He's not just preaching to their intellect or something else. In other words, you might say preaching is telling people who they are, right? It is a father saying, look, you're my son, right? I love you. How many times does God say that in the desert journeys? Somebody was asking about the prophets, but how many times does God just come to the people of Israel and say, look, you're my people. I'm your God, right? And the people have a hard time believing it. They just can't quite accept that. But that's really what preaching is. It's to tell them who they are now in Jesus, right? And so this sermon, 229, is one of his sermons on Easter Sunday, and it's to the infantes. Sermons to the infantes, these are the newly born, those who have just been baptized. They were baptized in the Easter Vigil, gone through catechesis, many of them for years, gone through catechesis in John and the Psalms, and then finally enrolled for baptism at Lent and were baptized. And here they are. They've been baptized, been clothed with the white robe, been anointed, probably also by this time have taken the Lord's Supper once, that first time. And now here they are back on Sunday, Easter Sunday afternoon. Now notice just his this is, I think, is just rhetorically quite nice. We'll just read those first 2 paragraphs. What you can see here, dearly beloved, on the table of the Lord is bread and wine. But this bread and wine, when the Word applied to it, becomes the body and blood of the Word. That Lord you see, who in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, was so compassionate that he did not despise what he had created in his own image, And therefore the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, as you know. Because yes, the very Word took to himself a man, that is the soul and flesh of a man, and became man while remaining God. For that reason, because he also suffered for us, he also presented us in this sacrament with his body and blood. And this is what he even made us ourselves into as well. Now, and so he's pointing to the bread and wine on the table that has just been brought forth in the great entrance. And he's basically going to say, this is you. You are this bread and wine, right? How the early church always understood it. The Christians are identified with the bread and the wine. Paul had done this, right? We who are many are nevertheless one loaf, right? And the Didache talks about as seed was, as the grain is scattered, it's now gathered into the harvest. Now notice kind of how he preaches to the catechumens based on this bread and wine. Call to mind, he tells them, what this created object was, this bread and wine, not so long ago in the fields. How the earth produced it. How the, whatever nourished it. What is that? Is that rain? Okay. Yeah, my glasses are blurring. But the rain nourished it, ripened it into the full ear. Human labor carried it into the threshing floor, threshed it, winnowed it, stored it, brought it out, ground it, mixed it into dough, baked it, and hardly any time ago at all produced it finally as bread. So notice the bread and the wine has a narrative to it. The bread is a narrative. Now he says, now call yourselves to mind as well. You didn't exist. Then you were created. You were carried to the Lord's threshing floor. You were threshed by the labor of oxen, that is, the preachers of the gospel. So there you go. You who preach are oxen. We can just call you ox. When as catechumens, you were being held back, you were being stored in the barn. You gave in your names. Then you began to be ground by fasts and exorcisms. Afterwards, you came to the water. You were moistened into dough and made into one lump. With the application of the heat of the Holy Spirit, you were baked and made into the Lord's loaf of bread. Right? Now, so notice that whole narrative identity. He's telling them, this is who you are. Right? You're here on the altar. You're this bread. Now, the key in the Eucharistic liturgy is what's that bread and wine going to now become? Through the liturgy, Christ is going to take it into his own hands and say what? This is my body. This is my blood. And in doing that, he's actually identifying you with his own body, right? This is the implication, right? So maybe if we continue there a little bit. So there you have what you have received. So just as you can see that what has been made is one, mind, you are one yourselves in the same way. Both the wine and the bread are integrated, right? You only have them by integration. Grapes have to be integrated into one cup, right? Into one wine. That's why I always they probably had the ancient world. I know this is it grates on you elitists, I suppose, on wine, but the ancient world, they had golden wine, which was all the grapes integrated into one wine, right? That's they didn't have this. We have our Pinot and we have our, we have our Cab, we have our. You had this golden wine, it was called, and it was certainly Augustine's kind of building on this. This is the picture of the church, right? I always thought somebody made communion wine, that's how they should do it, right? It should be this kind of integrated, all the diversities of grapes. Who was saying that? I think that was your wife that was saying she was going to take all your alcohol and mix it together or something. And, it'd be interesting to see what that tasted like. But that's the idea, right? All the grains integrated into one loaf. It's called grog. Right? So they are one, right? Mind you that you are one in the same way by loving each other, right? Here's your love again, right? By holding one and the same faith, one and the same hope, and undivided charity. When the heretics receive this sacrament, they receive what is a testimony against themselves because they insist on division. While this bread is a sign of unity, so too the wine was there in many grapes and has now been concentrated into a unity. It is one in the pleasant taste of the cup, but only after the pressure of the winepress. And you, after those fasts, have hard labors, after the humiliation and the contrition, have now at last come in the name of Christ into the Lord's cup, so to say. And so there you are on the table. There you are in the cup. You are this together with us. We all take this together, all drink together, because we all live together. Right? Now that's pretty good rhetoric, right? I mean, that's using an image in a very concrete, three-dimensional way. And you can hear this rhetoric that wants to seek to engage identity, not just trying to teach them a concept. Certainly the rational intellectual part is there, but there's definitely a deeper sense that he's preaching to their very nature. He believes his preaching affects their very identity before God, who they are. So that now with baptism and preaching, they're no longer what they were, right? They've been constituted in this relationship to God. So that's a little bit of Augustine and rhetoric. And we've got about a half an hour left, but we might just stop there with questions, and then we can maybe get one little last thing in before we have to close. But any thoughts here on rhetoric? Yeah.
I'm particularly interested in something that I don't think I've really fully plumbed yet. Maybe it can't be fully plumbed, but this ongoing discussion we're having, and I'm even having in my own mind, about written sermons as opposed to sermons where there's no manuscript. I tend to preach without a manuscript. I do use manuscripts sometimes, but there's something about the engagement in the Word and engagement with the Word while you're in the pulpit and you're ruminating and you're giving that rumination to the people. There's something about that you touched on a little bit ago that I think
Yeah.
I can't even fully appreciate. There's something there that we're all missing, I think.
Yeah, and there is it's difficult maybe to articulate. And I suppose there's a way in which people are different. I've always used a manuscript. I guess that's, maybe there's where there is a rumination in that where you are trying to come to terms with, at least how I see it. I mean, to write a sermon is suffering, a kind of how do I give voice to this, what God is saying here and what he's demanding of me. And a lot of times, that word of God convicts me, right? And tells me I'm not really, and there's a way in which you're trying to give expression to that. So there is a kind of a span of passionate kind of reactions as you're reading that text and finding words to preach it. But I think you're right. I mean, I think whether you do, and maybe whether you write the sermon or you just internalize it, and I like to think that as I'm writing it, I'm internalizing
It's just
it
a
and
little
also getting it
different
out,
step.
right?
One step.
It's one step removed or something. But I think you're exactly right that it is a deeply personal act, and to recover that preaching is not just functional. It's not just, you can't just stick an AI robot up there and put the words of Augustine in his mouth or something and get the same effect. That can't. It's what happening in that language is a personal exchange. I'm communicating my own being, right, to them. And there's where you might be right. I mean, if you get comfortable enough where you can do that honestly with your people, and I do think it takes a kind of honesty between you and your people. They know who you are. You know them. You know their narratives. You know the struggles they've had, that you can speak in a much more kind of extemporaneous way
Well, it's
that
not,
has a kind of narrative
it's
to
certainly not
that
without
interaction.
preparation. There's a lot
Yeah.
of preparation that goes
Yeah.
involved, but there's
No, sure.
this rumination, there's all these things on the shelf, so to speak.
Right.
That you can draw on while you're theologizing.
Right. Yeah, and I think as you have more experience, you have more of that, right? And you can do more with that, So yeah, no, I think there no doubt is something to that, especially with rhetoricians that are able to do more of that. The more experience they have, and the more they get kind of schooled and that kind of stuff. Another aspect here of kind of how you read the text as a narrative. I think our typical thought is that when we speak, if we tell our people about the flood, we think the flood is over. We think the event ended with Genesis 8 or 9 or whatever it is, right? And therefore, we're outside of it. The flood was in the past. It's an event that is no longer going on. It's ended, and we are over here outside of it, looking back. I don't think actually Scripture sees it that way, right? These events are always being rolled up into the narrative. They don't ever go away. Irenaeus uses the language, for instance, of recapitulation. Recapitulation is that notion. Recapitulation is a reading of the Bible. It's kind of like a snowball going down the mountain. And the snow that's there in the beginning, where is it at the end? It's still there, right? It just keeps being rolled up. It doesn't ever stop. There's a momentum to these events. And something like the flood, therefore, the narrative of the flood doesn't end until Christ comes, until baptism happens, right? It's only there that you kind of fully are seeing the momentum of that event, shall we say, that's inherent in that event. So, the form of those events was certainly the subject of a lot of meditation and thought, right? So, any other questions here before we,
Just going back to what you said about that we're communicating something from like our own being or whatever, that isn't there a fine line that you talk like that, but we often think, and I think there's some images in Scripture about this. Paul says he's an ambassador, that we're just sort of these messengers, And John even says, I'm just a voice, not just a voice, says, I am a voice crying in the wilderness, that there's really nothing from ourselves so much to communicate, but we're simply...
Yeah, and you're certainly right. And that sense that but you are in...
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
That the kind of the form of your life ends up being, I think, kind of from the scriptural point of view, or from kind of the way Jesus puts it, is one of self-denial, right? That you come into it denying yourself, right? That it's a communication that's actually coming from God, right? And you've been brought into it to give voice to it. And now it does involve you because you have your own relationship to God. But yeah, I mean, you're certainly right. It's not just about now I get to, everything about my personal life is great and I communicate that and I'm the example to everybody. There is a form to preaching and the pastor's very life that is one of, self-denial. I was trying to get that. I've thought about that in the sermon even today a little bit, trying to express it, and I try to express it at different times. That's the paradoxical freedom of the gospel, is the freedom to deny yourself. That's the form that Jesus' freedom has, right? The first thing he says to people when he wants them to follow him, the first thing he says is not take up your cross. The first thing he tells them is deny yourself, take up your cross. The very thing he then does at Gethsemane, right? Where he has his will. I don't want to do this, right? I mean, who wants to suffer, right? He experiences the fullness of that fear. But then he says what? Not my will, but not my desire. I would translate that again as desire, right? Not my desire, but yours be done, right? And so there is, you're certainly right. I mean, what you're trying to communicate, obviously, is that which comes out of God's own.
Right. I'm thinking of
Being-
more of the abuses of that.
Right.
Where you put so much of yourself, but you certainly see that with the evangelists that they are in there.
Yeah, they are in there. And Paul's going to talk about imitating
Yeah,
me.
I was thinking of the same thing.
all that
right,
stuff,
imitation.
so, and I don't want to say that's arrogance on his part. I mean, that's never the form of the gospel, right? He's an imitation precisely in his self-denial and his humiliation, right? The fact that he's been stoned and everything else. But
I mean, I think there is this, this necessity, because the Word of God is living, that, so I've spent a lot of time trying to think about and talk about, why do we preach at all? I mean, why don't we just read the Bible longer? Or even or why not just use old sermons that are really good? And there is this, Philip Brooks, in his famous lectures, I don't know if you're familiar with that, this preaching thing is, preaching is truth through personality, which sounds like really offensive to Lutherans, but I don't think it should be, because there is, again, this incarnational reality that the office doesn't exist apart from a person that is put into it who is real and living. And I think that I don't think that the point of the personality is you get up there and tell stories about your wife and children and, when I was thinking about this sermon, I thought I would do, that kind of nonsense. I think it's that you actually are bringing real angst and real experiences, and the Word of God is living and moving through you to the people. I find it, I mean, this isn't a question, obviously. This is
that's
a
fine.
Missouri
No,
Synod
that's
gathering, and we can pretend it's a question.
Yeah.
But, so,
I'm fine with that.
yeah, good.
Gives my voice a rest. I can let
I mean, there's
David
this,
talk.
this strange reality where it cracks me up, where I'll be like in a winkle and the pastors will talk about, what their people need to hear. And I'm thinking, how in the world would you know what your people need to hear? I mean, it says, this is impossible for me to know what the people need to hear. But what I can do to some degree, as the Spirit gives, is I can recognize that I needed to hear this.
Right.
And I think that's the kind of personality thing. And I think that the best sermons are those when you do kind of get into that
Yeah.
glimpse
yeah.
of the.
Right, and it does. I think preaching. You can't discount. Therefore, it's not just a matter of kind of the rational meaning of your words, but it does become your personhood in the sense of also how you relate to them. Right, that you have a history with them, you have a relationship to them, and that colors or conditions the way they are receiving it. Right. And that's both a cross, but it's also there's a blessing in that too, and it makes it difficult. But I guess what it gets to is your whole identity is a preacher. So everything you do is preaching, whether you want it to be or not. It just is.
Well, and you do have authority.
Right, sure.
I mean, you have been placed into office, you have been
Right.
called.
Right.
And I mean, so you're not up there just as a private individual giving a testimony.
No, right.
I mean, right. So
Right.
there's that side of it too.
Yeah, we're talking about your personhood in Christ, right?
Right.
That you're this member of the body of Christ. You're this member of Christ, and with this special authority to preach, right? To give voice to it. And there is a personality to that. Yeah, I think.
Feuerhahn has an essay about this where he talks about preaching for the church instead of preaching to the church. I don't know if I think it's that liturgical preaching.
That sounds like Feuerhahn.
Yeah,
That sounds
but
like
it is this kind of, sometimes we think about it as adversarial,
Yeah.
preach the law to them,
Right, right.
Walther style, and then
Yeah.
let them off the hook.
Exactly.
And Feuerhahn kind of wants to sort of, like the poet, give expression to their reality and help them articulate. And I think that's
Yeah.
also.
Yeah, and I think that's what Augustine's getting at, that
Yeah.
you're trying to create communion with them rather than this adversarial kind of thing, or us, me, thou kind of, or thou, you, or whatever it is, I, thou kind of thing, where you have power over them or something. It becomes adversarial or something. But you're trying to commit sympathia with them, and there is a rhetoric to that can kind of, this is who you are, this is what we are together, right? That we are struggling with this sin together, we are struggling before God together. I mean, all these people, these saints in the Scripture. I mean, how do you deal with Job and these kind of people? I mean, people are suffering. I mean, that's a very sympathetic kind of. They know what that is, right? This suffering before God, and there's a resonance, a fellowship that can be had in that, and therefore that's why suffering can be a good thing. It can create community, right? It can forge bonds that sometimes nobody wants to be persecuted, but I've always thought, studying the martyr church, for instance, the church was never more united. And had a certain sympatheia that it was significantly shaped by that, right? And could be again, depending on kind of what comes our way. But all right, we've got just a little bit of time left. Maybe we have to quit it in 15 minutes, right? Am I reading that right? What left do I want to talk about? I guess I would like to maybe put before you, we were talking about this, and we talked a little bit about personhood, personality, and I would like to maybe just put this before you. I don't know if I can really do it in 15 minutes, but at least give you kind of, these are some things that I've been thinking about and struggling with in different ways. And it does have to go a little bit with, I do think, one of the greatest conflicts of our time, and maybe here just talking about preaching and as a conflict with the devil, which is what the rhetorical battle is. Augustine recognizes that it's not just God and preachers that use rhetoric, the devil uses rhetoric and is quite good at it. Right? And therefore, and I alluded to this last night, but that the battle that takes place is in the passions. It is in the passions of the heart, in the desires. And I do think we are in the middle of a kind of, we've got the need to recover the profound sense of the theological understanding of the passions, I think is of crucial significance here. And I do think it shapes the way you use rhetoric, what preaching is. And I think we are in the battle of personhood. I might just put these, it's maybe a little bit perfunctory here in the time that we have. But we are in a kind of battle of personhood, I've always thought, between our modern day and what has been given to us. And maybe you resonate with this, maybe you don't. But I think really, especially since the Enlightenment, not just beginning there, but maybe even beginning before that, we have kind of defined personhood. When we think of what a person is, we have equated that and defined it psychologically. Really with a, shall we say, consciousness or a center of consciousness, or with a mind. One of the things the kind of Enlightenment has given us is the social sciences. I mean, some of you took offense that when I was being hyperbolic, but of criticizing exegetes. But it's not exegetes that I don't like, or even good exegesis that's grammatical and understands the grammar. But what's happened to exegesis is it's being dominated certainly in terms of higher criticism, by the social sciences. That is to say, if we want to uncover Isaiah's original meaning, we have to understand his psychosocial context, right? And that becomes the discipline of social sciences, right? We start to kind of examine his writings for psychological notions or understand the sociological context. And those psychosocial kind of disciplines have almost replaced and controlled the meaning of the text rather than theology does, right? That's kind of where higher criticism has gone, and where exegesis continually starts to go, is to kind of go into the social sciences. But the social sciences have given us a definition of the person that we who confess the Trinity and Christology, anthropology, I think, must resist in a fundamental way and recover. And what I mean by that, this psychological person, I would just define briefly this way. It begins with the mind and its contemplation. It then comes to the will and the centrality of the will, and that will being actualized in actions. That kind of definition. And what we've gotten to in this regard of the person as an individual, I have my own mind, right? What did Descartes say, I think? My identity is in my mind, and I have my own mind. I don't need anyone else. I don't need any external authority telling me anything. I don't need anybody else to tell me truth. I can, with my own mind, discover the truth myself, right? And come to understand it. And then with that mind, I can then will. I can act. The whole myth of the Enlightenment, the universities, is if you put good, rational truth into the mind, that's what the universities were. You had great libraries with all this. You're going to put truth into the brain, and then you will get good stuff out, right? We'll have a moral, scientific utopia. We'll have Star Trek, or something, where all the wars have ended, we've gotten rid of religion, and we're all just kind of in this scientific utopia or something, right? That kind of thing, right? This moral kind of view of the person that ends up being, and what it's morphed into is what I would call, what you're facing increasing in our culture is what I would call demiurgic man. Man has become a demiurge. You know what a demiurge is? Demiurge is one who can create his own world, right? By the power of his own will. By our technology, we can create my own identity, right? You might say that this personhood, that the individual believes himself in our world, that have an identity that's self-generating, self-originating, self-directed, and self-fulfilling, right? I can determine my own identity. I can create it. I can use technology to create my own world. And then I seek fulfillment in my own world. Anything that stands between my identity that I come to terms with and my self-actualization in the world, anything that stops that has to be gotten rid of, right? So we have all these bucket lists, right? If I'm going to live a fulfilled life, what does that mean to people? I've got to go to Paris. I've got to, I don't know. What's on the bucket list? I've got to go to church at Pastor Eckert's church. That's the bucket list. I can cross that off my bucket list now, right? Whatever it is. I want to eat a Kobe steak, right? Wagyu, whatever, $100 a pound, you have these different, I have to have all these experiences that seek fulfillment in this world, right? And this is what's being promoted, right? I always love those commercials, right? Where you want to buy this car because, look who's driving it. The guy's handsome and he's...
Matthew McConaughey.
Yeah, and he, then, you work and you make $1 million at this job, and then you get done with work and then you run a marathon just to stay in shape. And then you still have time to gather with your friends and drink Michelob or something or whatever you drink, And of course, and everybody looks great and everybody's happy. And this kind of, which has produced this self-fulfilling personhood, has produced an epidemic of depression. Because you can't live that life. Nobody. And it's become an enslaving reality. People are enslaved to their own will. In the ancient world, they had fatalism that was imposed from the outside, right? They believed the stars dictated their life and there was no hope. We have an internal fatalism, a fatalism of our own will and desires, that we have to do what we desire to do. I must fulfill my passions. If that's homosexuality, then I need to do that, right? And I'm going to be unfulfilled if I don't do that. Right? That whole sense that Freud has given us, right? Freud made the subconscious impulses a part of our DNA. They're who we are, and we have to give expression to that. And that has just been so corrosive, this individualistic, demiurgic man. And I think we do have to recover what I would call, I think, from the ancient church, I think it's evident in this preaching, is a genealogical personhood. And what we actually mean by this. We do not equate personhood with a mind. In the Trinity, there are not three minds. I mean, this is the first time I thought about it. There's one guy, it was a Baptist theologian, wrote a book on the Fifth Ecumenical Council. He found it fascinating. And I was like, wow, a Baptist is interested in the Fifth Ecumenical Council. This has to be. But what he ends up getting kind of strange because he takes modern psychology, personhood is a mind, center of consciousness, and he now applied that to the Trinity, right? That we have three persons, we have three minds in God, three wills, three actions, right? Christology goes the same way, right? If we have two minds in Christ, we have to have two persons. That was Nestorius. Right? Apollinarius had the same problem from the other end. He believed there was one person, so there could only be one mind, right, in Christ. The genealogical personhood goes differently here, and that is to say that we do not believe our identity is self-generated. Our identity comes from the Father. Here's where the passions become so important. The experience of the passions in the first sense, our hunger, our thirst, these movements of being, we cannot control with our will. I cannot choose to be hungry or thirsty or afraid or any of those things. I don't control that. Which, first of all, is the experience that my life and my identity precede me. They come from somewhere. My life comes from somewhere. I am from my mother and my father. I am from all the way back to Adam, all the way back finally to God, right? Thus a kind of theological personhood. So my identity finally, this is as we're telling people who they are, we're telling them who their Father is, right? That it is from the Father. Secondly, that instead of simply choice and the will, this personhood consists not in simply choosing, but this personhood consists in the communication of being. The communication of being itself. The Father's personhood is that He begets. That meaning He communicates being to the Son, an identity to the Son. That's how a father and a son relate, right? There's the exchange of identity in which the Father's identity is in the Son's identity is from the Father, right? And they are mutually constituted there together. So also our identity as Christians is in our loving of one another, right? The ability to lay down our life for each other. You might say here, this psychological personhood and the centrality of the will and of choice, of the demiurgic will, this leads to a very self-asserting personhood. I always think, kind of the virtues of our day are what? Ambition, self-assertiveness. I remember asking the faculty in one faculty forum, what place would we give in the formation of pastors to meekness? Not really a virtue of our day, right? We pay attention to people who are self-assertive and ambitious and get things done, right? That's kind of what this side kind of promotes. But over here is this humility, right, of this meekness that my identity is not about what I can do or finally defined by what I can do or what I can choose or my ability to actualize my existence. It's defined by that communication of love that comes from my Father, right? And from this community, from God. My identity is in Him and established in Him. I do think this personhood is why you're going to continue to have kind of the struggle with abortion, euthanasia. I mean, if you can't choose, you're not yet not really a person yet. You can't fulfill your own life. If you're an older person and you can't kind of will anymore, or you don't have self-awareness anymore, I just read a startling book that on the definition of death and the controversy on the definition of death that's going on in our country now. And you know what they're giving greater and greater emphasis to? Self-awareness. If you're not self-aware, you can't use your will, you can't actualize your life, harvest your organs, right? What's that? Yeah, and certainly abortion, euthanasia. That view of personhood, I just think this is what you're fighting. What you are preaching to people is who they are from a genealogical perspective, right? They are from God, they are constituted in Christ and His love and this communion with God. And finally, therefore, their fulfillment is in God, right? Their fulfillment is in the resurrection. It's in God. It's not in this world. And that, there's where I do think to reveal, one of the great tasks of preaching today, I think, is to reveal to people their slavery to their passions, to their will, to death. It's not so much now just telling them they are sinners. They probably won't believe you anyway. But it's helping them to see, aren't you tired of being a slave to money? Aren't you tired of being a slave to these passions? I mean, homosexuality is always treated or preached as if it's freedom. It's not freedom. You're enslaved to your own will, right? If your fulfillment is in the resurrection, the fulfillment is in God. And our people recognize that we do not yet know who we are, right? What does John say? Beloved, we are the children of God now, but it does not yet appear what we shall be. But we know that when the Son appears, we shall be like Him, right? That's an identity that opens up to eternity, right? The destiny of man has no bound. It goes into eternity. And that's freedom. That means we're free, and that's the paradoxical part. We are free to deny ourselves. We're free to live an unfulfilled life in this world. And that may not look like freedom or seem like freedom, but that's the great freedom, right? That we can actually do what we don't want to do and we can not do what we would like to do, right? Because our fulfillment isn't determined by that, right? It lies in God. So those are just a closing thought for you to just consider in terms of the preaching test maybe in our own concept. And I think this is very much an early Christian view of person. What they are trying to, when they're telling people who they are, it is about baptism. It is about that fulfillment that's found in the Lord's Supper, right? That's in the body and blood of Christ. That is that which sets us free. So, well, we have to close, I understand, at this point. So, enjoyed being with you very much, and hopefully my rambling around you didn't get too bored, but hopefully you got something out of it. And but blessings on your work, and I look forward to seeing you again sometime. So.